Hello and welcome to our class session for week 2. In this week we're going to be focusing on technical aspects of language and speech development as well as language acquisition. So our agenda for this week is going to be looking at language and literacy in social, cultural, and linguistically diverse contexts. We're going to do a recap of the 5 technical aspects of language that we spoke about last week. We're going to look at linguistic funds of knowledge and what those are for children. We're going to look at oral and written language, and we're going to look at a model of reflective teaching. Then there's a Kahoot link that if you want to play Kahoot on the topics that we've been discussing this week, you can go to that link and play. Then we're going to do a bit of a summary of the takeaways. And then we're moving into language acquisition by Stephen Krashen and go through some of his hypotheses and some of his theory. And at the end, we're going to sort of look at all of this from a teacher's lens, answering the question, what can we do as early childhood teachers? And we're going to review the homework that you're going to be completing this week as a recap. Okay, so we're going to start with some quotes from this week's reading. And I want you to think about these quotes as we sort of read them and discuss them a little bit. So Mariana Sotomayor and Jessica Martel say that it is essential to listen to the stories children tell and to genuinely value them in our teaching. So they think that what children have to say is going to be very important for informing what we plan to teach. Also, prior experiences are going to influence children's ability to make sense of a text. So the books are going to serve as mirrors for children so that they should be reflecting what kinds of experiences the children have already had so that they can see themselves reflected in these texts. So it's going to be very important as teachers to select texts that do actually serve as mirrors for children. The assessments of concepts about print, and this is one of the types of assessments that we're going to conduct as informal assessments to gather information about our focal children's language development and literacy skills. So this kind of assessments are most accurate when books are in the home language of the child. So this is particularly when we're talking about linguistically diverse children and children that speak other languages other than English. So these books are going to be help us. These books that are in the home language of the child are going to help us to gather accurate data when using these informal assessments. And they have a direct relevance to the children's interest, experiences, and background knowledge. So again, it's going to be very important when you're choosing the books and the text that you are going to be teaching with, that you take into consideration what children are interested in, what their past experiences have been, what their background knowledge is, and if the children speak a different language other than English, what their native language or their home language is. Beverly Otto says that when teachers define literacy in a manner that incorporates the ways in which reading and writing are used in children's homes and communities, children are better able to see the value of literacy in their lives. And as teachers, we know that it's very important to have the student or the learner be motivated to learn in order to actually achieve valuable learning outcomes. So we see that both of these texts that we are reading talk about a more holistic view of teaching literacy and language development with our students, because we're taking into account their interests, their backgrounds, their experiences, the home language that they speak, how these books and texts reflect these experiences for the children to be motivated and to be engaged with this kind of text and literature. So think about that because it's going to guide us into the perspective that this course is going to take on language and literacy development. So language and literacy development is a social and cultural practice that is going to be taking place in rich contexts of all people's homes and communities. So it's not necessarily only something that we're going to teach and learn in a classroom environment or in a school environment or in a learning environment, even if it's virtual, but it's something that's going to take place everywhere. Everywhere the children are, everywhere they engage with others, in their homes, in their communities, with their families, with their extended family, with their friends, and also in the learning environment that we're providing for them. So let's look at this. This is a picture of an Efi baby of 11 months who is skillfully cutting a fruit with a machete. So there is a watchful eye of a relative in the background, but this is happening as a culturally accepted experience for an 11-month-old baby. Now look at this image and think about what is your immediate reaction towards this. So some of you might be thinking, oh my gosh, no way. I would never give a machete to an 11-month-old to cut what looks like either a coconut or a papaya or some kind of bigger fruit, right? I would never do that. But in this case and under this context and for this particular culture, this is acceptable behavior. So when we think about learning and learning from a social cultural perspective and learning language taking into account children's prior experiences and their backgrounds, we need to think of situations like this that from our particular backgrounds might feel like extreme and unimaginable, but for this child's particular background, it's something that he or she would be completely engaged in and would be completely acceptable for the adults in this culture, the adults that are minding this child, that are taking care of this child, right? So just keep this in the background of your mind when you're planning and teaching the children that you're interacting with, that they might come from very different cultural backgrounds than your own, and they might have very, very different experiences than those that you have been exposed to. So let's briefly do an overview of the 5 technical aspects of language that we spoke about last week. We talked about pragmatic knowledge that had to do with the awareness of how to use language in different social contexts and the knowledge of when to use a type of language, say a more colloquial, a more informal kind of language versus when we use academic language, for example. Semantic knowledge is the schemata which allows us to label a specific concept and represent meaning and relationships and establish relationships among concepts. So it has to do with the meaning of a word that represents a particular concept, a particular object, a particular experience or feeling or action. Syntactic knowledge has to do with combining words to create meaningful expressions according to the grammatical rules or the language rules of a particular language. And we'll see that all languages have grammatical or systemic rules to how we use it and how we combine words to create sentences to convey meaning. So this has to do with that, with those rules. Morphemic knowledge has to do with the knowledge of word structure, so that each word has a different grammatical function within a sentence, and what is sort of the order in which we put those words together in order to convey meaning. Phonological knowledge has to do with sound and the relationship between each symbol, each letter as a symbol, and the sound that is associated, or sounds that are associated to those symbols. And being able to discriminate between phonemes and be able to accurately pronounce these phonemes in a demonstration of prosody. And okay, so linguistic funds of knowledge. These are the knowledge base that the children are going to bring with them into the classroom. And they're going to continue to develop these kinds of knowledge with the support of the teacher. So with your support. So linguistic knowledge is one type of, or one funds of knowledge that the children brings in. And it's when the child uses language accurately to communicate, to convey meaning, and to just communicate with others via oral language or via written language. Metalinguistic knowledge is when the child demonstrates an understanding about language, either by using it correctly or writing it correctly. When they, for example, write a sentence and they capitalize the first word of the sentence, or they use a period at the end of the sentence. So they're demonstrating that they understand rules and grammatical knowledge about language, and they know that you capitalize when you start a sentence and you put a period when you end it. Verbalization of metalinguistic knowledge is when the child is able to articulate aspects of language features. So when they can actually say to you, well, in English, when we write a sentence, we capitalize the first word. And they're able to say that, to explain that to others. And so those are 3 levels of linguistic funds of knowledge that the children can bring into the classroom and that you can observe. You can observe them using it correctly or testing things out while they understand how to use language correctly. You can see that they have a metalinguistic knowledge of understanding about how language works, and then they could have a verbalization of this metalinguistic knowledge when they don't just do something to demonstrate that makes evident that they understand some aspect of language, which would be the metalinguistic knowledge, but they actually can verbalize and explain what they're doing. So that would be a little more advanced fund of knowledge where there's a verbalization of that metalinguistic knowledge that they have. So when we look here at language, we have oral language and we have written language. So we're going to have those 2 modes of language that we're going to be observing in our focal children, right? So we're going to, when we talk about language modes, we're going to talk about oral language and written language. But then there's two characteristics that this both oral and written language can have. And so language can be receptive or it can be expressive. Receptive language has to do with the tasks of listening and reading. It's when you're receiving and being receptive to meaning or information through listening and reading. Expressive language is about producing a meaningful message. So you can do it through speaking or you can do it through writing. So when we observe our focal children, we're going to observe them in both of these language modes, and we're going to look at both ways in which language can be used as a receptive or as an expressive vehicle. So Otto talks about reflective teaching, and this image that you see here comes from Otto's 2015 edition of the book, but in your 2019 edition, you're going to find it in page 5 in figure 1.2, and it looks a little bit different than this one, and that's why I chose to keep this one here because this seems a little more illustrative than the one that she has in the 2019 book. So what she's saying here is that to make decisions from a reflective teaching perspective, you need to take into account many things. So you have your formal curriculum where you're getting your information of what is it that you need to be teaching for that particular age group that you're teaching or that particular grade level that you're teaching. And then you are looking at your own intuition about learning and teaching. And what is that telling you? So what is your gut intuition telling you about what these particular children that you're working with need? And then you also have your professional knowledge and training. So the training that you're getting from courses like this one and all the courses that you're taking in your teacher preparation program, right? And then you have the direct observations of the students and how they're learning and how they're responding to your instruction. So you're going to take all those pieces of information that are coming from different sources, and that is going to help you make your reflective teaching decisions in terms of what to teach and how to teach it to the particular student population that you have in your classroom. So remember what we talked about before in terms of having this social cultural perspective to language and literacy development. And so your observations of student learning and the responses that they have to your instruction is going to be paramount because the students are going to all have different backgrounds, different experiences, and they're going to bring into their classroom those funds of knowledge that are going to be different from child to child. So that's going to really inform your practice from a reflective teaching perspective. So now I have, okay, so here's the link for a Kahoot game that you can go play if you desire to. And you're going to see that there's questions about different types of funds of knowledge and different technical aspects of knowledge and how social and cultural linguistic environments influence knowledge development or language development. And so you can play if you want, and the link is going to be under week 2 in Blackboard. So what are the takeaways that we are gaining from this lecture so far, right? So one is that learning is complex and multifaceted. So it's not a straightforward, easy task, although we're going to see some things in a moment now that are going to talk to how there are some subconscious acquisitions that have to do with language development. Another takeaway is that there are many perspectives on language learning, and our class in particular is going to take a social cultural perspective to language and literacy learning. Another takeaway could be that oral language feeds into written language competencies, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, more about that in a second. So some things that we know for sure. There are 5 aspects of oral language. These 5 aspects are reflected in written language as children develop language knowledge. And we must find ways to foster children's funds of knowledge to help them continue to grow and develop. Okay, so we're going to move into Language Acquisition by Stephen Krashen, and I'm going to ask you to pause this video right now and go watch the Stephen Krashen video on language acquisition and come back. You're going to find that link under week 2 on Blackboard. Okay, so after you watch the video, I'm going to highlight some of the language development aspects that Krashen talks about, but you have this in detail in the reading for this week that's coming from Krashen's book. So I'm just going to highlight some things that I think are important of the 5 hypotheses of language that he shares. So the acquisition and learning hypothesis talks about language acquisition versus language learning. And so he explains that language acquisition is a subconscious process that happens without us knowing that it's happening. And it's typically the way in which we learn our native or our first language. It is stored in our brains, and then it is pulled from, or we pull from it as we communicate with others. Language learning is the explicit teaching of aspects of language. For example, the grammatical rules that we are taught in schools, that are direct instruction, that are very explicit ways of highlighting aspects of language that we need to know. So what he highlights is that we need both of these types of language development, or we need both of these types of acquisition and learning in order to develop our language ability. But both of them has to do with the comprehension that we acquire from both the acquisition and the learning component of language development. So the natural order hypothesis is one in which he explains that there is a natural order in which we learn different aspects of language. And even if we try to advance or teach a more advanced component of language, if it's not the right time, or if prior predecessor knowledge that has to do with that particular component of language has not been acquired yet, it's not going to be learned. So that we need to follow this natural order in terms of helping advance language development. The monitor hypothesis has to do with also a little bit of this acquisition versus learning in terms of language development. Because he says that while we're using our acquired knowledge of language, we have this monitor or editor in the background, or that comes to the forefront to sort of edit what we've said or what we've spoken or what we've written. And he says that this monitor is coming from our conscious learning of language. So because we know that there's certain rules and certain expectations of what language needs to look like for it to be accurate, we use this monitor to edit our language. And the monitor comes from that language learning experiences that we've had. So even if we're using our language acquisition knowledge, that subconscious knowledge to communicate, the monitor is going to come from the language learning component of our language development. And sometimes that monitor can slow down our development if we're too concerned about getting it right or getting it accurately. It's going to delay or slow down our language development, but that monitor exists. The other hypothesis is the input hypothesis. So he talks about I+1. So if the child is at level I in terms of language development, we need to find the I+1 in terms of comprehension to help the child continue to develop in their language trajectory. So, and this, again, all of this is going to be further explained in the readings, and I don't want to sort of spend too much time on this because you have the first-hand readings to look at. The affect filter hypothesis has to do with social-emotional aspects, and he talks about how situations that are stressful or that are anxiety producing are going to serve as a filter for impeding that language development occurs. So he talks about, so he reminds us of Chomsky's language acquisition device, and he says that the affected filter is a blockage that occurs in order for the learning and the both the learning and the acquisition of language gets to that language acquisition device, which is the part of our brain that allows us to develop language. So what he is advocating for is low anxiety kinds of environments in which the child feels secure and confident in language learning and in language acquisition, so that the language knowledge can get into that language acquisition device without the filter, the affective filter. So Krashen also has a hypothesis for reading, and he says that we develop literacy similarly to how we develop language, and it's through comprehensible input. So this is going to be really important, regardless of if you're teaching grammar or if you're teaching syntax or phonics. It's really important that the input, the content of what you're teaching, is comprehensible for the students. And it's going to be really important in language development, and Krashen says it's going to be really important in literacy development as well. He also says that we learn to read by reading. And it's not that we have to wait to learn to read to then read. That by reading and attempting to read and practicing reading is that we actually develop the skill of reading. He says that free reading is the major source of our vocabulary, our spelling, our grammatical competence, and our writing style. So the more reading we do, the more we amplify our vocabulary, the more we perfect our spelling, the more we understand what the grammatical rules are, and the more improvements we're going to see in our writing style. So he also says that the development of literacy can occur without formal instruction, because there's many cases, research that have been documented through research that make this evident. But that comprehensible input is not enough to develop academic language. That is what we need to succeed in school. So what he's saying is that we need both things. We need the development of literacy occurring in a informal way in which we're acquiring language subconsciously, but we also need to learn language through direct instruction and the study of the language itself. So lastly, I wanted to touch upon the relationship between literacy and language and cognitive development. So Krashen says that through free reading and enterprises are the two main activities that we can provide as teachers in classrooms for our children to develop language and to develop cognitively. And by enterprises, he's talking about problems that the children are really interested in solving, and that are problems that will naturally engage the children in reading, in writing, and in discussing. So in oral communication, right? So if we ask the children to free read by them selecting the reading materials that we have available for them and choosing which one they prefer to read, and to explore ways to answer those burning questions that they have that are interesting to them and that are worth responding from their perspective, we can engage children in reading and discussing and in writing. And by engaging children in reading and discussing and writing, then we're going to develop language. And by that, he means writing style, grammar, vocabulary, and spelling. And we're going to develop their cognitive areas by learning about facts and ideas. So this is one way that we can ensure that we're facilitating or supporting language and cognitive development for children is through this free reading experiences and this enterprises, which could be planning a unit around a question that the children pose. Like, for example, why is it important to vote in this country? Like talking about what's coming soon with the elections, and children might be inquiring about that and exploring the answer to that question. The children are going to have to read, are going to have to discuss, are going to have to write, and are going to have to practice all of these skills that are going to help them then augment their language and cognitive development. So aside from these two activities, what else can we do as teachers? So we can use the natural approach that is explained in Krashen's reading for this week. And we can also use translanguaging pedagogies. And translanguaging pedagogies, as proposed by Ofelia Garcia, have to do with understanding that children bring into the classroom all these funds of knowledge and have a very ample linguistic repertoire, even if they're not fluent or proficient in English. So they can come to your classroom with an ample linguistic repertoire, and by using translanguaging pedagogies, you're allowing the children and promoting them to use all of these linguistic tools that they bring in sort of their linguistic toolbox to learn and develop their proficiency in English as they acquire and learn the English language. So another thing that we can do is have a view that does not look at language as from a deficit perspective. So eliminating the word gap thinking and embracing language development and linguistics as differences and not deficits. So we can have that sort of change of paradigm in the way that we think about the children that come to our classroom, looking at what they bring as assets and not as deficits. Another thing that we can do is observe the language used by the children in our classes and think about the actions that you can take to promote language equity within the specific children that you're working with. Another thing that is going to be important is to make eye contact and to establish a shared reference when you're talking about or when you're presenting a text for the children. You want to be cognizant that all cultures do not value eye contact in the same way, and that for some children it is a form of respect to look someone in the eye when you speak to them or when they speak to you, and for other children it's a form of disrespect to do that, and it's more of a challenge and more a disrespectful behavior when you actually make eye contact and someone is talking to you. So sort of to use those typical guidelines that we have of interacting with children with a grain of salt, specifically if the children are coming from different backgrounds than our own. Establish communication loops. So when you can speak, you can listen, you can respond, and then the speaker that initiated a conversation can become the listener and have the roles swapped with the child. You can practice verbal mapping by describing and not just naming objects or actions, using a lot of details to orally identify the concepts that you're teaching or that the children are experiencing in a particular moment. And then use child-directed speech. And you can find this in your Otto book in the chapter for this week. And child-directed speech is going to involve short and well-formed sentences tied to immediate context, so use of language that's tied to immediate context, use of language that is repetitive. When you're using oral language, to use a higher pitch than you would usually or typically use, to speak at a slower rate than you would typically speak, and to encourage participation by, for example, asking open-ended questions or critical thinking questions to the children. Okay, so I wanted to point out that the interview questions for the speech therapist or the speech pathologist or the speech specialist are on Blackboard. This assignment is due on week 5, so I want you guys to start thinking about who do you want to interview and perhaps start contacting speech therapist, specialist, or pathologist that you know, that you to set up a time where you can meet to ask them these questions and gather the information that you need in order to complete this assignment. Okay, so we are to the end of this week's lecture, and the homework for this week, you're going to read from Soto, Manning, and Martel chapter 2. You're going to read from Otto's book chapter 1, and you're going to read that PDF from a section of Krashen's book, which is on Blackboard. There's a link to play Kahoot if you want to do that. There is the link to Krashen's video that you should watch, and then there is a discussion board prompt that has to do with how will you be applying this week's readings to inform your role as a reflective teacher. So that is it for this week. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you again in week 3.